Prince William had made a decision about Camilla's daughter, and by the time anyone inside Clarence House understood what was happening, every legal instrument needed to stop it had already been switched off. What began as a photograph arriving at Kensington Palace quietly became the most constitutionally significant move William had ever made. And at the center of it all were two pieces of jewelry that had not appeared in any official royal inventory for more than 20 years. The question the palace could not answer was simple. Whose decision was it to make them disappear? Before we go any further, subscribe now, because this story has several layers the headlines never touched. What comes next changes how you read everything you thought you already knew. But that decision only makes complete sense once you understand what was waiting on William's desk several weeks before any of it became visible, and why what he found there could not be ignored. The first chapter of this reckoning began in the heavy silence of the Wiltshire countryside at 5 in the morning. As the first gray lights started to touch the horizon, several vehicles moved toward a private estate with a precision that suggested this was no routine inquiry. The officers who stepped out did not arrive with the frantic energy of an emergency. They moved with the measured calm of those who already held every necessary authority. They carried a high court enforcement order and a ministerial-level search warrant, legal instruments that had been prepared in total secrecy long before the sun rose that morning. There had been no courtesy phone call between households, no quiet warning passed through royal channels, and no family discussion of the kind that usually precedes a move of such permanence. The woman whose home was about to be entered was Laura Lopes, the daughter of Queen Camilla. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must consider what it takes to point that kind of institutional machinery at a family so closely linked to the crown. The warrant was not a general request for information. It was a surgical document that named specific rooms and identified specific objects with forensic clarity. The entire operation had the unmistakable quality of something that had been staged weeks in advance, with every procedural box ticked and every legal vulnerability mapped out, so that by the time the officers knocked, the outcome was already a formality. Two objects were removed from the property that morning. The first was a black diamond pendant hanging from a fine gold chain. The second was an intricate sapphire bracelet with a clasp that, according to those familiar with the history of the collection, had not been opened in more than 20 years. In the official court paperwork, neither piece was described by its sentimental value or family history. They were logged precisely as disputed crown property, specifically referenced as belonging to the estate of Diana, Princess of Wales. This was not the language of a private disagreement over an inheritance. This was the language of an institution reaching into a private life and declaring that these items were never legally yours to hold. While the search was being conducted, a second and more devastating strike was already in effect. The day before, a Mareva injunction had been quietly filed in the High Court. Such an order is not a gentle legal hold, it is a financial eraser. It froze every account connected to Laura Lopes' name, every investment portfolio, every trust arrangement, and every private holding she had built over years of living near the center of power. She could not move money, and she could not hire the level of legal defense a situation of this magnitude required. Her ability to fight back had been effectively switched off while she was still asleep. The invisibility of the operation was perhaps its most telling feature. There were no cameras at the gates and no journalists waiting for a statement. Confidentiality orders had already been secured, legally preventing financial institutions like Coutts and Barclays from even acknowledging the existence of the freezes. The entire event existed inside a sealed legal space that the public could not see into. Laura Lopes was left standing in the aftermath of a process she never saw coming, her resources suspended and her options narrowed to nothing. But as the vehicles pulled away from Wiltshire, it became clear that this raid was not the beginning of the story. It was merely the final instruction in a sequence that had started weeks earlier, in a room she never entered, during a conversation she was never meant to know had taken place. Queen Camilla did not learn about the legal earthquake from Prince William, nor did she hear it from King Charles. Instead, the news arrived through a formal legal notification that landed at Clarence House with no context and no explanation. It was written in that flat procedural language that makes the severity of a situation impossible to misread. Imagine the shock of being the queen and discovering that a monumental legal strike has hit your own daughter, not through a family conversation, but through a document that reads like a cold financial bill. Her immediate reaction was to contact her legal team, The central question she needed answered was whether sovereign immunity, the constitutional protection that shields a reigning monarch, could be stretched to cover her daughter. The answer came back within hours, and it was a crushing blow. It could not. Sovereign immunity is a specific and bounded concept. It does not travel to private citizens, regardless of their proximity to the throne. Under the law, Laura Lopes was a private individual facing a high court injunction, and there was no royal lever Camilla could pull to halt the process. What became clear to Camilla's advisors was that the entire architecture William had built was designed precisely to close those doors before she could even find them. He did not merely win a fight, he removed the possibility of a fight before she even knew she was in one. Inside Clarence's house, there was no shouting and there were no slammed doors. Instead, there was a particular suffocating stillness. It was the kind of silence that settles over a room when every person in it understands that whatever they might say is already too late to change the outcome. King Charles was present through those hours, but his presence carried a weight of its own. He knew more than Camilla yet understood, because he had already sat in a room with his son and made a choice. He had not told her. The weight of what he had not said was present in every glance and every unspoken word. It was the silence of a man who had decided that some things are better left unsaid until there is no longer any other option. To understand why this landed with such force, one must consider what Camilla had spent 23 years constructing. She entered public life as arguably the most resented figure in the entire country, facing a generational dislike that would have broken most people. She survived it through an almost supernatural instinct for when to be invisible and when to step forward, slowly turning contempt into tolerance and tolerance into something resembling acceptance. That journey cost her more than the public could ever fully measure. Sitting inside a household that had been silenced before it knew it was under pressure, she began to realize that William had studied everything she had built. He had identified the exact point where her structure was weakest. This was not just a legal maneuver, it was a psychological reckoning. But to understand how this connects to the future king, we must look at the hidden trigger, because the silence at Clarence's house was born from a moment weeks earlier that changed everything. What most of the public noticed about Prince William's announcement that May was the headline figure, £500 million liquidated from the Duchy of Cornwall's commercial real estate portfolio. The official explanation was smooth and politically comfortable. It spoke of housing initiatives, community reinvestment, and a modernization of how the duchy puts its assets to work for the public good. It was the kind of announcement that generates exactly one news cycle before evaporating into the background of responsible governance. However, what almost nobody noticed was which specific holdings William chose to liquidate. These were not selected randomly, nor were they picked primarily for their property value. According to internal palace documents that later surfaced, they were identified because of the financial networks they quietly supported. For over 20 years, certain private trusts and civilian funds had been operating in the gray zones of the royal estate system, moving wealth in directions that benefited Queen Camilla's household and her wider family circle rather than the direct line of succession. These arrangements had never been formally documented as improper. They existed in the deliberate ambiguity that surrounds institutions as old and opaque as the British monarchy, not quite visible enough to challenge, but not quite invisible enough to ignore. William had been watching these patterns for a long time. His advisors had urged restraint, warning him that moving against these networks would be read as an act of aggression by both King Charles and Camilla. They suggested a more gradual approach to avoid permanent damage to family relationships. William's response, according to those close to the conversations, was that the clarity of intent was the entire point. But even a structural move of this scale could not provide what William truly needed. He required something documentable and physical, something with a clear legal history that could be placed before a court. That was when a single photograph arrived at Kensington Palace. It had been taken inside Sotheby's during a routine intake process for a private appraisal. When the staff in William's office saw the image, the room went completely still. Those were not just pieces of jewelry. They were artifacts William had last seen as a child during a confrontation with Camilla, a moment that had never been resolved in the decades since. A black diamond pendant and a sapphire bracelet had been absent from every official inventory and public appearance for more than 26 years. Now, They were being logged under the name of Laura Lopes as ordinary civilian property, ready to be sold to the highest bidder. The people in the room realized that this was not just about wealth or property. It was about the memory of his mother, Princess Diana. William did not make a phone call or ask for an explanation. He realized that the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. He gathered his documents, canceled his international schedule, and began the drive to Sandringham, carrying a leather binder that contained more than just a request. It contained a challenge to the very foundation of his father's authority. But what was truly inside that binder would change the constitutional landscape of the monarchy forever. William did not arrive at Sandringham to seek a fatherly chat or a compromise. He had already bypassed all informal channels, choosing instead to engage Farrer and Company, the legal firm that manages the most sensitive constitutional matters for the crown. By the time he sat across from King Charles, he had cleared his entire international schedule, signaling that what was about to happen was his absolute priority. Inside the leather binder William carried was not a heartfelt appeal or a plea for the return of family heirlooms. It was a letters patent for asset reclassification. This was a sophisticated constitutional document built upon a specific and devastating legal argument. It proposed that if the health or judgment of the reigning monarch reached a point where he could no longer adequately safeguard historical crown properties, the heir apparent held the legal standing to petition the Privy Council directly. This petition would trigger a process to transfer executive authority over those specific assets to William's office without requiring the consent of the king. The room must have felt very small in that moment. William was not acting as a grieving son. He was acting as a constitutional operator who had mapped the full perimeter of his own father's vulnerability. He presented Charles with a binary choice that allowed for no middle ground. If the king signed the decree, he would lose control of the disputed jewelry, but keep the matter private. If he refused, he would provide his son with the justification to make the king's perceived decline a matter of public constitutional record. There was no version of this meeting where Charles could emerge with his authority fully intact. The king looked at the signature line. By setting his pen to the paper, he was not just returning a pendant and a bracelet to the direct line of succession. He was acknowledging that William had been correct to challenge him. One signature was all it took to reclassify the items as crown property, held exclusively for the direct line of the Prince of Wales, bypassing Queen Camilla's household entirely and permanently. It was a moment of profound personal and institutional weight. Neither man spoke of what this acknowledgement would cost their relationship in the months to follow. When William closed the binder and walked out, the air in Sandringham remained heavy with what had been left unsaid. Most people see this story as a son protecting the memory of his mother, Princess Diana. While that version is true, it is incomplete. This was the moment William demonstrated he was willing to make his father's vulnerability explicit to achieve a strategic end. As William's vehicle left the estate, the signed decree was already being processed. It dropped straight into a legal pipeline that had been constructed long before the meeting took place. The signature did not start the process. The process had been waiting behind a gate that only Charles could open. By the time the king set down his pen, the first instructions had already been drafted, and the machinery of the state was ready to move at a speed that would leave the rest of the family breathless. But as the legal gears began to turn, a new mystery began to surface, one that suggested the two pieces of jewelry were only the beginning of a much larger disappearance. On the 23rd of May, the legal firm representing Kensington Palace filed a Mareva injunction with the High Court. While the term might sound like a standard legal hold, in practice, it is a financial eraser. It does not merely pause a few selected transactions. It suspends an entire financial life. Within minutes of the order reaching the necessary institutions, every investment portfolio, private trust, and current account connected to Laura Lopes became inaccessible. There was no window for deliberation and no internal review by senior managers at banks like Coutts or Barclays. The High Court order carried an authority that demanded immediate compliance, leaving the account holder with no resources to organize a defense. At the same time, a series of confidentiality orders were secured to seal the media environment. Financial journalists at major publications had already begun to notice the unusual patterns of frozen activity. These were professionals who understood that a simultaneous freeze across multiple institutions only happens during a significant legal crisis. However, the orders did not prevent them from seeing the truth They prevented them from telling it. The silence was not an accident. It was a deliberate architecture. Even the internal communications of the monarchy were brought under this new command. The Buckingham Palace press office received directives that were not phrased as requests. They were legally barred from confirming or even discussing anything related to the royal collection or the legal proceedings against Laura Lopes without the express approval of Prince William's office. This placed Queen Camilla's own household inside a cage of silence. For over 30 years, her team had worked tirelessly to build relationships with the press, turning hostility into a form of institutional protection. William's legal strategy rendered those decades of work worthless in a single afternoon. The journalists she trusted were now legally prohibited from connecting her name to the crisis. This is how the machinery of the state operates when a constitutional decree is set in motion. The private secretaries, lawyers, and administrators who executed these steps were not acting out of personal spite or loyalty to one side of the family. They were following the cold logic of the signed paperwork. The decree had the force of a warrant, and the system had no mechanism for the registration of an objection, only for the processing of an instruction. By the time the sun rose on the 24th of May, the operation had only one step remaining, and that step was already unfolding at the gates of a private estate in Wiltshire. The fight was over before the target even knew it had begun, but as the pieces were gathered, a startling discovery was about to be made. In the hours following the raid, the lawyers reached by Laura Lopes were forced to be blunt. The situation was not ambiguous. It was absolute. The decree signed at Sandringham had already reclassified the black diamond pendant and the sapphire bracelet as crown property. The injunction had already paralyzed her ability to resist. There was no narrative she could release and no public pressure she could generate because every avenue had been identified and sealed before she even realized a conflict existed. She had lived her life in the gray areas that often surround those close to the monarchy, where tradition and loose record-keeping create a comfortable fog. William had simply reached into that fog and replaced it with the cold, hard lines of the law. Inside Clarence House, the atmosphere had shifted into a suffocating stillness. This was not the chaos of a house under siege, but the quiet of a household that had realized its options were gone. For more than 20 years, Queen Camilla had managed her public image with a precision that left no margin for error. Her greatest strength was her ability to read a room and calibrate her response. But William had built this entire legal architecture in a space she could not see, using instruments she could not access. Her survival instinct, honed over 2 decades, was useless against a machine that moved faster than the news cycle itself. The legal climax arrived on the 14th of June during a High Court hearing that was remarkable for its lack of drama. The proceedings were quiet and purely procedural. Laura Lopes' legal representative submitted a signed agreement, formally surrendering all claims to the 2 recovered pieces. The court accepted the surrender without question. In exchange, the court allowed limited access to a portion of the frozen funds, just enough to cover administrative costs and begin the slow work of reconstructing a financial life that had been suspended for 3 weeks. To any outside observer, the matter appeared to be a contained dispute that had reached a tidy, if lopsided, conclusion. But that surface resolution was a trap. As part of the proceedings, the High Court had commissioned a comprehensive audit of the Highgrove repository. This was a condition William's team had insisted upon to ensure a full accounting of his mother's effects. When the results of that audit were returned, they produced a number that the courtroom was not prepared to absorb. The official records indicated that 14 documented artifacts should have been housed within the repository. 2 had been recovered from the estate in Wiltshire on the morning of the 24th of May. 12 were missing. They were not misplaced, nor were they lost in an administrative error. They were gone. The case that had seemed so close to a final settlement had suddenly cracked open, revealing a much deeper and more dangerous void. The High Court audit was intended to be the final step in a successful recovery, yet it became the catalyst for a revelation that shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. The official ledger for the Highgrove repository had listed 14 specific artifacts belonging to the personal collection of the late Princess of Wales. Only 2 had been recovered from the Wiltshire estate. The other 12 were gone. Forensic accountants soon discovered a paper trail that bypassed all standard royal channels. The missing items had been transferred through a private holding company registered in the state of Delaware. This was a calculated choice of jurisdiction, selected specifically for the opacity of its corporate laws and the serious practical barriers it placed between a British court order and the assets registered inside it. The Morava injunction, so effective on domestic soil, held no authority over a shell company on the other side of the Atlantic. The investigation took an even more destabilizing turn when a classified file from the Ministry of Justice audit was leaked to a small circle of journalists. It contained a coded designation that linked the Delaware entity to a specific location, the Montecito connection. The implication was impossible to ignore. It suggested that 12 of the most symbolically powerful pieces of royal history had been moved beyond the reach of the High Court by someone with the resources and the motivation to keep them. Inside Clarence House, the air was heavy with the weight of this discovery. The conversation between Queen Camilla and King Charles was not the heated confrontation one might expect. It was something far more exhausting. They sat together as two people who had arrived at the same recognition by very different paths. They realized that the foundations of their shared world had been permanently altered. The assumption that their domestic and financial arrangements would continue indefinitely was no longer a reality. Camilla now understood that this crisis had not begun with a photograph at an auction house. It had been shaped by the silence Charles had chosen to maintain when he sat with his son at Sandringham. He had signed the decree, and in doing so, he had acknowledged a shift in executive authority that could never be unlearned. The weight of that unspoken decision was now the most prominent thing in the room, a silence that carried the force of a confession. Even as this personal reckoning unfolded, the legal case was formally brought to a close. The two recovered pieces were secured within the new Diana Heritage Trust, sealed away from any future claim. But 12 pieces of the princess's legacy remained in a legal void, connected to a designation that no official was yet willing to discuss in public. It was at this moment that William decided to speak. His public statement was remarkably brief, yet its precision was designed to trigger an explosion that no legal instrument could prevent. Prince William's public statement was a masterclass in institutional precision. It consisted of a single, carefully constructed paragraph that managed to communicate the full weight of the recent crisis without naming a single person or acknowledging a specific legal battle. He stated that his mother's legacy was not a commodity to be bargained over or have its history obscured. He concluded with a 5-word sentence that would be analyzed for weeks. The boundary has been set. Royal correspondents, who have spent decades deciphering the subtle language of the palace, understood immediately that this was not a conclusion. It was a signal. The use of the word boundary created an interpretive vacuum that the media was eager to fill. Television networks ran the statement on a loop, while constitutional experts and royal historians were brought in to parse every syllable. They looked for precedents of an heir apparent making such a bold declaration about crown property, yet they lacked the full picture. The confidentiality orders remained in place, shielding the raw details of the raid and the injunction from the evening news. What the public actually received was a carefully curated version of the truth. Along with the statement came the announcement of the Diana Heritage Trust. This new legal entity was designed to house every documented piece of the late princess's jewelry and personal artifacts, bypassing the household of the reigning sovereign entirely. The named beneficiaries were Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and Princess Charlotte. The arrangement was presented as permanent and exclusive, ensuring that these items remained beyond the reach of any future negotiation or claim from other branches of the family. The narrative was clean, moving, and easily absorbed. A son was drawing a line to protect his mother's memory for his own wife and daughter. It was an effective story, but it was not the whole story. Buried deep within the technical filings of the trust was a detail that almost no one in the press caught. The documentation was built to cover 14 artifacts, not just the 2 recovered from the estate in Wiltshire. 14. Yet, in the rush of the news cycle, no one paused to ask why the math did not add up or where the other 12 pieces currently resided. The story quickly crossed international borders, with the American and European press adopting the framing William's team had so carefully engineered. In Montecito, there was a notable absence of sound. No statement was issued, and no comment was offered to the dozens of journalists seeking a reaction. That silence was, in many ways, more significant than any public rebuttal could have been. While the world discussed the protective boundaries of a son, The palace itself remained silent about the forensic trail leading to Delaware. The public felt a sense of closure, believing the heirlooms were safe. They did not realize that the most important part of the statement was the part William had left out. The institution had communicated its intent, but the final evidence of this victory was not found in words. It was found in a single public appearance that allowed the cameras to see what the legal documents could only imply. The resolution of the crisis did not announce itself through a press conference or a televised address. Instead, it was expressed through the silent, highly choreographed language of a royal garden party at Buckingham Palace. Within weeks of William's public statement, the family gathered for an event that has occurred annually for over a century. In this setting, the hierarchy of the institution is not spoken. It is seen in who walks with whom, the order of entry, and the physical space maintained between family members. The cameras captured William and Catherine arriving together, their body language notable for its quiet, settled quality. It was the kind of ease that communicates a matter has been resolved, rather than merely managed. Beside them was Princess Charlotte. In a detail that would later be analyzed by historians, she wore a small sapphire piece at her collar. It was consistent with the documented artifacts from the personal collection of Princess Diana. No announcement was made, and no history was provided to the press, yet the message was plain for anyone to see. The legacy had moved to the future princess. Queen Camilla performed her ceremonial role with the practiced ease of a woman who has navigated difficult public moments for more than 20 years. However, the physical distance between her position in the procession and William's had the quality of something that had been meticulously negotiated. They were close enough to suggest family continuity to the casual observer, yet far enough to communicate a clear boundary. Her public face was immaculate, yet those who had observed her for decades noted a specific composure, the stillness of someone who has accepted an outcome and is now demonstrating that her acceptance is genuine. King Charles stood between them, navigating the complexity of being both the head of the institution and its most humanly exposed member. His posture carried the weight of a man who had signed a document he could not unsign, standing in public evidence of the consequences. The walking order told the story that the legal confidentiality orders had suppressed. There was also a missing presence that everyone noticed, but no one named. No one connected to the Montecito address appeared on British soil in the weeks following the statement. The institution communicates its boundaries most powerfully through the architecture of what it omits. The absence was the boundary. To the journalists and the public, the sight of the sapphire on the young princess was the final period at the end of a long, invisible sentence. The statement had been made without a single word being spoken. The garden party concluded, and the cameras moved away, but underneath the surface of this display, the reality remained. Charles had signed away a portion of his authority. William had demonstrated his power, and while 2 pieces were now visible on the next generation, 12 pieces were still unaccounted for. The symbolic victory was complete, but the institutional aftermath was only beginning. On the surface, it appears that almost nothing has changed. King Charles remains the reigning monarch, and Queen Camilla retains her titles, her household, and her place within the ceremonial architecture of the institution. Laura Lopes has returned to a life of privacy, her name removed from the headlines, and her voice bound by confidentiality provisions that prevent her from ever discussing the 3 weeks that suspended her financial world. The 2 recovered pieces of jewelry sit securely within the Diana Heritage Trust, and the palace's external presentation of stability remains completely intact. Yet, stability is often a surface condition in an institution as old and opaque as the British monarchy. What sits beneath it does not disappear just because the legal proceedings have concluded. When Charles signed that document at Sandringham, he acknowledged through a formal act that his son possessed the constitutional standing to supersede his own executive authority over crown assets. That acknowledgement does not expire with the resolution of a single crisis. It exists now as a demonstrated reality. The private secretaries, the legal advisors, and the administrators now understand with total clarity where the effective center of authority resides. It is no longer a future arrangement contingent on succession, but a present reality. Camilla's position has also been permanently altered. While she holds every official role she held before, she no longer carries the assumption that her household is beyond challenge. William demonstrated that the press relationships she cultivated across 3 decades can be legally switched off before she even knows they have been withdrawn. That understanding is permanent, and it changes the way every room in the palace is read. Finally, there are the 12 missing pieces. They remain outside the reach of British law, connected forensically to the Montecito designation and unacknowledged in any official communication. These are not simply objects. They carry the weight of everything Diana represented to the institution that could not contain her and to the public that could not stop loving her. William answered the question of ownership for the pieces he could reach, but the 12 he could not recover remain someone else's answer, held in reserve for a purpose that has not yet been declared. William protected what he could touch, but the parts of his mother's legacy that remain beyond reach may tell us more about the institution and about the people who survived her than the parts that were ever recovered. And I do not think we have heard the last of them. What do you think? Is the person holding those missing 12 pieces finished, or are they just waiting for their moment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to be here when the next layer of this story surfaces, and it will, make sure you are subscribed. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.